So tonight I'm going to begin with a person and a story that we've shared a couple of times here at the question already. Now, I've concluded that this person and this story are somehow mysteriously intertwined with our journey to ask important questions about the nature of truth in our lives. Last time we explored the story of this person was last October when we discussed the question of intolerance and how unique people like her have transformed intolerance from a toxic lie into a catalyst for truth. Now, I've chosen to briefly retell her story, not so much because of what she's done, but more because of why she's done it. And in the telling, I hope to begin a conversation about the reasons why we do what we do in our lives. I don't know if you recognize her. Most of you may have recognized her. Her name is Malala Yousafzai. She's the youngest ever recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize at age 17. She is a global icon and a champion for the right of every child to receive an education. Now, in 2009, when Malala was only 12 years old, just another ambitious and bright young student in the Taliban-controlled Swat Valley region of Pakistan, she began to experience the toxicity of intolerance. Now, the Taliban, practitioners of the most medieval form of Islamic extremism, imposed a ban on girls' education throughout the Swat Valley, including Malala's hometown. Now, they enforced this ban through brutality and terror, burning down schools, murdering teachers, schoolmasters, police officers, and forcing the closure of over 100 girls' schools in their area of control. Now, as a result, many young girls in the Swat Valley abandoned their dreams of an education as a matter of survival. But a small resistance movement, of which Malala was a part, continued to attend school, either in secret locations or even hidden inside boys-only schools, which were still allowed by the Taliban. Now, at the same time, at age 12, Malala began her own personal campaign of speaking out against the Taliban's extreme intolerance and gender discrimination. At age 12, she became active as an online blogger for the BBC under a pseudonym to protect her from the Taliban, as well as her blog described life under the Taliban, as well as her own passionate views about a girl's right to education. Now, over the next 2 years, the Pakistani government began to forcefully retake parts of the Swat Valley back from the Taliban. So as a result of this, Malala was able to emerge from anonymity, and she became something of a national celebrity through interviews on television and radio. Now, her important views and new celebrity made her an important enemy to the Taliban as well. In October 2012, when she was just 15, Malala and 2 other girl students were returning from an exam, riding secretly in the back section of a van. The Taliban gunman stopped the van, opened the back door, and asked this question: "Who is Malala? Tell me or I will kill you all." Malala stood up, not wanting her friends to be harmed, and she said, "I am Malala." The gunman shot her in the head, wounded the other 2 girls anyway, and then fled the scene, like the brave guy he was. Because of an amazing medical response to the attack, Malala miraculously survived. And during her long recovery, Malala became an even more powerful voice for children's education around the world. While she was still in hospital, the UN presented an official petition bearing Malala's name to the government of Pakistan, demanding the right to education for all children and calling for an end to all discrimination against girls. In 2013, she published the book, I Am Malala, which has become a global bestseller. And that same year, after audiences with the Queen and President Barack Obama, Malala, now 16 years old, was invited to speak at the UN, where she called for worldwide access to children's education. And during that now famous speech, despite her own horrific story of brutal intolerance and personal suffering, she uttered these powerful words. The terrorists thought they would change my aims and stop my ambitions, but nothing has changed in my life except this. Weakness, fear, and hopelessness died. Strength, power, and courage were born. I'm not against anyone. Neither am I here to speak in terms of personal revenge against the Taliban or any other terrorist group. I'm here to speak up for the right of education for every child. I want education for the sons and daughters of the Taliban and all terrorists and extremists. I think she had it right. In 2014, at age 17, Malala was the youngest ever person to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. And she also founded the Malala Fund, which now gives away millions of dollars every year to open girls' schools, support teachers, provide tuition for higher education, and to provide educational opportunities for refugee communities in some of the most violent and intolerant areas of the world, places like Syria, Lebanon, Nigeria, Yemen, Iraq, and Pakistan. Now, Malala's young life is truly an amazing story. Couldn't disagree with that, right? So amazing, in fact, that it's relatively easy for ordinary people like us to reverently dismiss the relevance of her story for us. Malala's story seems amazingly inaccessible to us and possibly unnecessary for ordinary people. Because we live in our very ordinary and mostly tolerant corner of the world. And you know what? We would be mostly right to think that. That is, if we focus on what happened in Malala's life. But what if we focus on why Malala's life story is so amazing? There were, after all, thousands of young girls pursuing an education in the Swat Valley alone. And there are, after all, over 100 million more girls in other developing countries facing discrimination, fear, violence, and even death because of their educational goals. Why did Malala choose her important path before and after literally facing death? Why did she do what she did? Well, one possible answer to that question is this. Malala had a calling. Okay, and tonight, as the mighty wake of her amazing story subsides, what's left is the same question about why you do what you do in your life. Do you have a calling? Now, before you react to that question, let me first ask you to not reverently dismiss the question. A reverent dismissal, I didn't realize how significant this term was when I wrote it. Reverent dismissal is our way of recognizing that generally the idea of a calling in life is an intriguing mystery with a history. For example, if you're a religious person of any persuasion, you don't have to reach very far to grasp the significance of a perpetually burning bush to the biblical prophet Moses. You automatically recognize the importance of Siddhartha Buddha receiving universal enlightenment while sitting under the legendary Bodhi tree. Now, if you're not religious, history is full of remarkable instances of calling. I just saw an incredible World War II movie about Winston Churchill called Darkest Hour. I'd recommend it to anyone, in which he openly states that at age 65, he fully believed that he was being called to change history at that exact moment in history. And so he did. Okay? It wasn't a religious calling, but it was a calling nonetheless. So we can probably agree that the general idea of a calling carries a certain amount of built-in reverence, okay, based on the amazing deeds we associate with so many of these historic examples. But for the same reasons that we are reverent toward the idea of a calling, we are often dismissive of the idea that we ourselves could become part of this mystery with a history. It seems obvious that we are not Malala, we're not Moses or Buddha or Churchill. It's quite reasonable to think that we will never achieve what these remarkable called individuals achieved in their fabled lives. We're smart enough to know that our circumstances would have to radically change and be different for us to answer a similar mysterious calling to change history. So as a result of this reverent dismissal, even if we don't really mock the idea of a calling, we can dismiss the idea as being irrelevant or non-applicable to us personally. We unconsciously assume that the proof of a calling in someone's life is somehow equated with what one does and with the magnitude of one's deeds. So often we dismiss the idea of a personal calling by fixating on the what, the outcome. This is Moses parting the Red Sea. Rather than the why, right? The inspiration that's really at the core of this important question tonight. Do you have a calling? Mark Twain said this about his calling. The two most important days in your life are the day you were born and the day you find out why. This was his creative way of saying that the important personal what of our lives will flow from some kind of a personal encounter, like a deep understanding of the important why of our lives. The possibility of understanding why we are here is the possibility of understanding if we have a calling. So, for the next little while, I'll again ask you to not reverently dismiss that idea for yourself. Now, I thought the best first thing to do in this question of your calling would be to take the idea out of the stratosphere of history or legend and focus it back on a more accessible, more personal sphere for each of you. So as Mark Twain said, to paraphrase, first you're born, and then you find out why. And if I can be extra presumptuous to paraphrase the paraphrase, we exist and find out why, and then we know who we truly are. In other words, Mark Twain was basically saying that when you know your identity, you'll know your calling. So in a way, our question for tonight, do you have a calling, could also be expressed in this way. Do you know your identity? Now, look, even the pure vanilla dictionary definition of calling points us toward the inward sphere of personal identity. Webster's dictionary says it's a strong inner impulse toward a particular course of action, sometimes accompanied by conviction of divine influence. Collins' dictionary calls it a profession or career which someone is strongly attracted to, especially one which involves helping other people. Oxford says it's a strong urge toward a particular way of life or career. It's a vocation. The strong inner impulse to act, the strong attraction to a career, the strong urge toward a way of life are all textbook descriptions of what happens when we experience who we are, when we discover our identity. So calling is not simply what we do. Okay? That's a job. A calling is who we are. That's an identity. Okay, so for those of you who are naturally skeptical about the idea of a personal calling, okay, and skepticism is one of the guiding principles of the question, the corollary idea that such a calling emanates from some intrinsic personal identity can be a little bit like a skepticism vitamin. Put another way, for the truly skeptical, the mystery of being called is only made more implausible by the mystery of identity. Easy to believe that you're not being called if you don't believe you have an identity. But for the truly skeptical, I want to briefly share a couple of possible identity points, completely rooted in science, that might raise additional questions for you about this. Okay? Here's something about our brain. The first and most ancient level of our evolutionary brain is generally called the reptilian complex, or reptilian brain. This level of our brain contains most of the simple neural structures that are present in reptiles and is the basic engine for our involuntary biological activities such as heartbeat, breathing, body temperature. Now, apart from regulating these essential biofunctions, the reptilian brain is also the repository of our most primal instincts for survival and reproduction. Okay? In other words, it's the should I kill you or should I mate with you, a part of our brain. The reptilian complex is the first foundational component of our embryonic brain, and is, scientifically speaking, the only part of our brain that isn't influenced or altered by what we learn or experience after we're actually born into the world. It's the closest thing to being our original, pure neurological essence. It's possibly the birth home of our identity. Now, here's something about our mind. Sigmund Freud, pretty much the father of psychoanalysis, originated the term id to describe the deepest component of the human psyche. It contains all of our original drives, primal instincts, and our fundamental distinctiveness as a psychological human being. The id is the only part of our humanness, conscious or unconscious, that pre-existed in us when we were born. Our id was all that we were before we were exposed to the outside world, before we experienced the relationships, the influences, the expectations, the complications, and the conflicts that end up shaping every one of us. Now, Freud said that the ego and the superego components of our psyche perform those shaping functions. But put another way, our id is the cornerstone of what truly makes us a unique individual, and not just a conditioned, compatible member of the human herd. According to Freud, our id wasn't acquired or learned. In Freudian terms, it was a gift. So here's a sub-question for the skeptical in the room. Now, even if you've been sincerely doubtful about the existence of your true identity, or the idea of a true calling in life, could neuroscience or psychology give you an excuse to consider the possibility? You could safely accomplish this, because giving consideration is not the same as giving over. Let's think about it. Now, for the less skeptical out there, and I know there are some, allow me to move the question about your calling even closer to that inner place you suspect may be your identity. And since by nature you're more open to the possibility, would it surprise you to know that there are various possibilities, which often begin as questions, that could lead to an understanding of your identity, and then perhaps your calling? These questions are like a group of alternate doors to the same house. And these questions will be our version of Shakespeare's famous assertion that a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. In our case, it's a calling by any other name. First question, what do you love? Now, let me share two perspectives on this question, which will seem light years apart, but in reality illustrate how love can be one possible door to your calling. The first perspective is a blog post. No worries. First perspective is a blog post from an anonymous, ordinary citizen on Vancouver Island. It struck me as being significant because this is not a Malala story of a calling to change the world. It could be the story of our next door neighbor or college classmate. It could be your story. It's a very quiet calling, but a calling nonetheless. I'm just going to read it to you. I was a librarian in my provincial government. I'm being vague because there aren't many librarians in the provincial government I work in. Worked long hours and was stressed and hated my co-workers. My parents retired out to a small town on Vancouver Island. Came out to visit them in February, and I spent a week catching up with my parents, going out, walking along the beach, and hiking in the forests and up mountains. I'd moved out here by the end of June. I now work 3 days a week in a local shop and spend a few extra hours a week teaching people technology in their homes. I have a crappy little apartment where everything in it is run down and older than I am, but it's right in the middle of a tiny town. Out one window, I see the mountains. Out the other, the ocean. Out the back is a provincial forest. I may not make much money at all, but I make enough to pay the bills and sock away a few $100 every few months. I live simply, but I love every day of it. No regrets at all. I'm with my family. In fact, my sister moved out here as well. I love my job, my coworkers, and every day I step outside, look around and say, wow, I'm so lucky. Now, the second perspective on the question, what do I love? are some words from an actual, bona fide world changer, Steve Jobs. In June 2005, he gave a famous commencement speech to the graduating class of Stanford University. Some of you may have heard it or read about it or heard about it. Here's just a small excerpt. Sometimes life hits you in the head with a brick. Don't lose faith. I'm convinced that the only thing that kept me going was that I loved what I did. You've got to find what you love. And that is as true for your work as it is for your lovers. Your work is going to fill a large part of your life. And the only way to be truly satisfied is to do what you believe is great work. And the only way to do great work is to love what you do. If you haven't found it yet, keep looking. Don't settle. As with all matters of the heart, you'll know when you find it. And like any great relationship, it just gets better and better as the years roll on. So keep looking until you find it. Don't settle. But just like our anonymous ex-librarian from Vancouver Island, Steve Jobs, in his calling, was his response to the question, what do you love? Do you have a passion? Now, Webster and Oxford describe passion as an intense, driving, overmastering feeling or conviction, barely controllable and not governed by reason. Now, full disclosure, I have a fear of heights, and that activity is definitely not governed by reason. It's true. Now, for those of us who have experienced the total irrationality of love, Andrew, you kind of referred to that earlier, is it not a little bit humorous to think that by comparison to passion, love is like the mature, reasonable sibling of the identity family? The reason I say that is in the last two stories of calling, involving the question of deciding to do what we love, their process did sound kind of reasonable and mature, didn't it? Like the gradual dawning of our identity, a romantic conclusion about what we love, a conclusion that we reach only after a proper courtship has taken place. Okay, but with passion, there are other stories, like the story of author Amy Tan. Okay, her story of calling is more like a sunburst than a sunrise. It's definitely more about passion. This is the story that reminds me of you, David. Now, before the 1 million copy sales of the Joy Luck Club, The Kitchen God's Wife, and The 100 Secret Senses, Amy Tan was already a writer. She was a business writer. She and a partner ran a technical writing business with revenue-producing billable hours. Okay, it was a great job. Her role with clients was largely that of account management. But this daughter of immigrants wanted to do something more creative with her words. So she made a pitch to her partner. I want to do more writing. He resisted and declared that her strength was doing cost estimates, going after contractors, collecting bills. But this was the very stuff that Amy hated doing, even if she was pretty good at it. And her partner insisted that writing was her weakest skill. So Amy thought, look, I can believe him and just keep doing this, or I can make my demands. So she argued and stood up for her rights. He would not give in. Shocked, Amy said, okay, then I quit. And he said, you can't quit. You're fired. Sounds kind of familiar. And then he added, you'll never make a dime writing. So Amy set out to prove him wrong, taking on as many writing assignments as she could. Sometimes she worked 90 hours a week as a freelance technical writer. Being on her own was tough, but not letting others limit her or define her talents made it worthwhile. And while on her own, she felt the freedom, finally, to try her hand at writing fiction. And so, her debut novel, The Joy Luck Club, featuring the bright, lonely daughter of Chinese immigrants, was written. And the fired writer, who couldn't write, became one of America's best-selling, best-loved authors. Great story of passion. And sometimes the passion of our convictions, when opposed by the passion of naysayers, creates just the right tension for our identity to emerge. It's kind of like, even though I've never experienced this personally, it's like the painful contractions of labor and delivery. It's not a gentle emergence, but more like a dramatic birth of our calling. That's what happens with passion. Do you have a dream? Dreams are omnipresent in our lives. What other human phenomenon besides our basic life functions takes place both intentionally and spontaneously, day or night, waking or sleeping? Our dreams inspire us, they frighten us, they mystify us, and sometimes they can define us. It's precisely because of this omnipresence that our collected dreams can become like psychological wallpaper or white noise in the background of our day-to-day reality. We're conditioned to think that our dreams are something that we wake up from to face our reality. And such is the way of most dreams. We wake up from them. But do you have a dream? A recurring desire, a goal, a vision for yourself that isn't just wallpaper, but is more like a portrait of your real identity? This kind of dream makes you wonder about the possibilities of altering your reality to pursue it. This kind of dream becomes a calling. Now, I was pleasantly surprised by this story I'm going to share with you. It's about an actual altered reality driven by a dream. He was no scholar, and his classmates teased him a lot. Rather than read, the kid really preferred running around with an 8mm camera, shooting homemade movies of staged wrecks of his model train set, which he showed to friends for a small fee. In his sophomore year of high school, he dropped out. But when his parents persuaded him to return, he was mistakenly placed in a learning disabled class. He lasted 1 month. Only when the family moved to another town did he land in a more suitable high school, where he eventually graduated. After being denied entrance into a traditional filmmaking school, he enrolled in English at California State College at Long Beach. Then in 1965, he recalls, in one of those serendipitous moments, his life took a complete turn. Now, while visiting as a tourist to Universal Studios, he met Chuck Silvers, an executive in the editorial department of Universal. Silvers liked the kid who made 8mm films and invited him back to the studio for a random visit, just to visit. He appeared the very next day. Now, without a job or security clearance, he was dressed in a suit and tie, carrying his father's briefcase, with nothing but a sandwich and a few chocolate bars in it. He strode confidently up to the guard at the gate and gave him a casual wave. The guard looked at him and waved back, and he was in. But for the entire summer, he remembers, I dressed in my suit and hung out with the directors and writers, including Silvers, who knew the kid wasn't a studio employee, but he winked at the deception and just kind of let him do it. He even found an office that wasn't being used, and he became a squatter. He bought some plastic letters and secretly put his name on the building directory board. Steven Spielberg, room 23C. 10 years later, 28-year-old Steven Spielberg directed the blockbuster Jaws. So, of the many dreams, night or day, that you have in your life, is it possible that one of them could be a vision for your life? Possible projection from the light source of your true identity. A possible calling that might drive you to buy some plastic letters and alter your reality to pursue. Do you have a voice? Well, of course you have a voice. What I mean is, our voice is how we communicate, not just verbally, but in our writing, in our music, in our physical actions, in all of our expressions, and all of our relationships. Andrew is expressing his voice tonight. But ask yourself, is it your true voice? Tom Hanks, the great actor, okay, wanted to try his hand at writing. So he experimented. By the way, this is in his home. He collects typewriters. And he's got like, I think, 150 typewriters or something. Anyway, he wanted to try his hand at writing, so he experimented with some short story pieces. He sent one of his early stories to his friend, Nora Ephron, a noted screenwriter, such films as When Harry Met Sally and Sleepless in Seattle, with a request for some editor's notes. Hanks recounted that after some deliberation, Ephron sent back the draft with a few technical comments in the margins, but she also made a single large notation on the last page written in red Sharpie. The notation read, voice, voice, voice. Now, any artists in the community will likely understand this notation. It means be distinctive, be yourself. But for this reason, I actually think it applies to everyone, artist or not, because it applies to all of our personal expressions in the world around us. So, once again, allow me to offer two perspectives on this question about our voice from both ordinary and extraordinary sources. Between them, they point us to the possibility that our voice can be our truth. Has anyone read Zen Habits? It's a blog. It's a fairly famous blog. The Zen Habits blog writer Leo Babauta wrote this about finding our voice. Creators of any kind must find their voice. We are writers, musicians, designers, programmers, parents, builders of anything. We are not truly expressing ourselves and speaking the truth until we found our voice. The tone, style, tenor, pitch, personality we use to express ourselves. Our voice is our essence, writ plain for the world to see. Now, a reader and a fellow writer asked me how I found my voice, and I have no easy answer. I'm not even sure I can say I've fully found my voice yet. It's a quest that doesn't seem to end. I'm learning, and I hope my learning helps yours. This is written for writers, but the ideas are the same for anyone who creates anything. So, write a lot. Experiment boldly. Learn to hear yourself. Find what feels true. Find clarity. Remove the noise. Use your voice. Once again, here's Steve Jobs from that same Stanford University speech. Your time is limited, so don't waste it living someone else's life. Don't be trapped by dogma, which is living with the results of other people's thinking. Don't let the noise of others' opinions drown out your own inner voice. And most important, have the courage to follow your heart and intuition. They somehow already know what you truly want to become. Everything else is secondary. Now, is it possible that our inner voice and our outer voice are meant to be the same, or even the same thing? The same voice, our one voice. If our inner voice is spoken from our identity, then is our outer voice an expression of that identity? And ultimately, is the expression of our identity our calling? Do I see a need? Now, there can be no exploration of the question about our calling without including this possible doorway into the house. Perceiving a need and acting upon it is a different kind of pathway to a calling. It's because it's more of a reaction to the external than an action from the internal. Now, we can certainly be compassionate without being called. Well, I think we all know that. But the door of need can often be the entrance to the most profound and transformative room in the house. And I'll close tonight with this great story of need and calling. In 1987, a 22-year-old medical student was walking through New York City's East Village. He walked by a tiny shop with a uniquely decorated storefront, so he stopped for a moment and entered the shop. He was met by the owners, a husband and wife team named Angel and Carmen Perez, both former heroin addicts, both dying of AIDS. The shop was devoted to materials, books, tapes for recovering addicts, and despite their grim circumstances, Angel and Carmen were enthusiastic about sharing their dreams with a young medical student. They took him to the back room in the shop and proudly showed him a scale model of the Museum of Addiction that they wished to build. The model was made out of used plywood and tongue depressors. Then they showed the student a pile of letters rejecting their requests for funding. They had been rejected by all levels of government, all nonprofit organizations, and many wealthy private citizens, including Donald Trump. Interesting point. In addition to being gravely ill, Angel and Carmen said that they were just weeks away from having to close their shop due to lack of funds. The young med student was so moved by their story and their dream that he offered to help them get the word out in the local media. So he began to call the local newspapers, TV, and radio stations with the story, but was met with complete disinterest. As a last resort, he dialed the number of a small community radio station and connected with the station manager, who was also, I guess, the chief DJ. The station manager surprised him by showing interest in the story. However, the manager said he had no staff to cover the story. So he suggested that the med student interview Angel and Carmen himself and send in the tape to the station. The med student would later recall that the minute I hit the record button, I knew that this was what I was going to do for the rest of my life. The interview was aired on the local community radio station, but was randomly heard by a prominent producer from National Public Radio who just happened to be driving through the city. The little interview was picked up for national broadcast by NPR. And the med student went on to become a highly respected, award-winning radio producer and best-selling author. His name is David Issei. And this is how his unexpected response to someone's need became a calling. He wrote a book, by the way, called Callings. David Issei is also the founder of StoryCorps, an amazing nonprofit organization with a mission to facilitate, record, and archive the personal stories, inspirations, and callings of ordinary people from every walk of life all across the US. This mission is accomplished through a unique model that starts with mobile recording studios set up in trailers and modular units. These studios are made available to anyone who wishes to honor a special inspirational person in their lives. A parent, grandparent, a sibling, a friend, a mentor, or a hero. The applicant and the honoree are invited to the StoryCorps mini studio, and with the help of a facilitator, the applicant actually interviews the honoree about their life, their experiences, their influences, and yes, their calling. The interviewer is guided by this basic question. If this was to be our last conversation, what would I ask or say to this person who means so much to me? As you can imagine, the honorees are not Malala or Moses. They are ordinary people, teachers, coaches, parents, factory workers, social workers, artists, the real community. StoryCorps edits and polishes the interviews for upload to their website. You should go to it, storycorps.org. And each interview is sent to the Library of Congress in Washington to be archived, to inspire future generations. From its founding in 2003, StoryCorps has recorded and archived over 250,000 individual interviews of extraordinary, ordinary people, just like Angel and Carmen, just like you. Now, even though their Museum of Addiction was never built, it was first their dream, their calling, that inspired David Issei's mission to record the callings of thousands. All because of a simple recognition of a simple need. Now, I want to leave you tonight with one last question that might motivate you to explore the possibility of your own calling, whether you believe that such a thing exists or not. There are a lot of overlapping studies that deal with job and career satisfaction. And as near as I'm able to tell from my general research, the averages look something like this. Only you can tell if you're part of these statistics. 50% of employed people are dissatisfied or unhappy with their jobs. 70% of employed people are partially or wholly disengaged from their jobs, just kind of going through the motions. The average number of job changes in a person's life is 12. That's 4.4 years per job, approximately. Now, I'm not trying to say that every job we have is supposed to reflect an important personal calling. And it's completely unrealistic and impractical to think that our jobs have to be a profound expression of our true identity. Don't have to be for us to effectively perform them, because sometimes we just need a job. We all understand that. But in the stories of calling that are shared tonight, these stories of love, passion, dreams, voice, and need, there is one common thread that binds these stories together and also connects us to the possibility that we too have a true calling. That thread is restlessness. Now, if we're dissatisfied, unhappy, or disengaged from our jobs, what are we really experiencing deep in our hearts? Restlessness. If after just a few years, 4.4 years if we're counting, we find ourselves moving on to the next job in our succession of next jobs, what fuels that serial transition? Restlessness. Is it possible that job dissatisfaction, unhappiness, or disengagement are just the superficial textbook expressions of the deeper restlessness in our lives? Now, if we're operating in this textbook paradigm, and I'm not suggesting that any of you are textbook people, allow me to offer restlessness as an alternative paradigm with alternative questions. Could restlessness be the spiritual wind in the sails of our dissatisfaction and unhappiness, disengagement, or our serial departures from our jobs? Why might this alternative paradigm of restlessness be important for you? Well, because restlessness doesn't provoke job questions like how much or how long or where to next. Restlessness provokes identity questions like, what do I love? What is my passion? What is my dream? What's my true voice? Do I see a need? Do I have a calling? Restlessness is the language of our identity. Restlessness is our identity in protest. Restlessness is a calling for our calling. So, this is my final questions to you. Okay? Have you been listening to your identity? And are you even just a little restless now? I hope so. Well, thanks for your patience. That's the end of the presentation.